Welcome to this episode of Travels with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Peter Jay Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. And today we travel to the border between France and today's Belgium, between France and Flanders, to the city of Valenciennes. And in one of the main squares of Valenciennes, you will find this monument, this fountain, which celebrates one of the most famous artists born in Valenciennes, Watteau. And it's actually designed and made by another artist who was born in Valenciennes, the sculptor Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. Watteau was born in Valenciennes in October 1684, while Carpeaux was born there in 1827. And the city commissioned this monument to celebrate the great painter in the 1860s. It was made between 1867 and 1868. There are beautiful models by Carpeaux for this monument, the one on the left showing the whole fountain at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, the one on the right for the main statue of the monument in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Valenciennes. When we think of Carpeaux in New York, of course, we often think of the great Ugolino and his sons, the marble sculpture that is one of the great works of art at the Metropolitan Museum in the great sculpture court there, showing the episode from Dante's Divine Comedy, from Hell, from the Inferno. When I look at this sculpture, I always think of a very strange and mysterious link to the Frick collection. In the late 19-teens, Henry Clay Frick was planning to expand his house, and he asked his architect, Thomas Hastings, to come up with designs for further galleries that would go further east of the West Gallery, where today we have the Oval Room and what we now call the East Gallery. And so Hastings designed a sculpture gallery for Frick, and this is one of the designs we have in the Frick archives showing this. And of course, this includes a series of sculptures that Frick never owned. So you see that in the prominent place on the right, there is, of course, Carpeau's Ugolino, and next to it, the Bernini bust of Cardinal Richelieu. The Richelieu bust is now at the Louvre, was never available to Frick, and Ugolino only joined the Metropolitan Museum and New York in 1967. So I cannot quite explain why Thomas Hastings included these specific sculptures in his design for a sculpture gallery for Frick. But I always find it funny when I see the Ugolino at the Met, thinking that the architect Hastings had this idea of Ugolino standing at the Frick in the sculpture gallery. But this evening, I would not like to talk about Carpeaux in detail. Instead, I'm focusing on Watteau. And this is not just because Watteau was born in Valenciennes, but because one of the paintings at the Frick, in fact, the only work by Watteau at the Frick, is again linked to the city of Valenciennes. Valenciennes, as I mentioned, was on the border between Flanders and France. It was in a very strategic position, which meant that even though for a long period of time it belonged to what was then known as the Spanish Netherlands, it was a constant site of battles between France and the Spanish. And this went all the way into the 17th century. In 1656, the French siege Valenciennes. There was a famous siege of Valenciennes, and they actually lose. Valenciennes remains in the Spanish Netherlands. And about 20 years later, in 1677, Louis XIV again lays siege to Valenciennes. And this time, the city passes to France. And so from the 1670s, from the Treaties of Nijmegen in 1678, Valenciennes becomes French. And about 6 years later, in 1684, Watteau is born in that town. Watteau grows up in Valenciennes. Of course, the surname Watteau with a W, it's originally a Flemish surname, which of course is then made into a French surname when the city becomes French. Here you see Watteau in one of his portraits this is by Rosalba Carriera, the Venetian pastel portraitist. And Watteau moves as a young man to Paris and dies very young in Paris and spends most of his career in Paris. But he does return as a young man to Valenciennes, to his birthplace where his family was. And when we think of Watteau, we think of his great fête galante, his great scenes of ladies and courtiers and musicians and commedia dell'arte, masks and people partying and dancing and playing music in beautiful, idyllic gardens. This is one of my favorite fêtes galantes by Watteau. It's the Fête Vénitienne. Obviously, I like it because of the Venetian link, but Watteau is someone who looked a lot at 16th century Venetian art, and this was a painting inspired by that. It's now in the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh, and we had it on loan at the Frick a few years ago, and it is a really extraordinary picture. Frick collected great 18th century works of art. Think of the Fragonard Room, think of the great bouchers that we have at the Frick. But it is surprising that he never acquired a Watteau. During his lifetime, it seems that Watteau was never on the list of artists he was considering acquiring. And even though later on there were plans by the Frick to acquire a number of works by Watteau, which were offered to the museum, this didn't in fact happen. We didn't fill this gap until very, very recently, until 1991. Just before that, a woman called Artemis Redpath passed away and left a substantial gift to the Frick collection. And my predecessor, Edgar Munhall, decided to use that gift to acquire this very beautiful Watteau. And not only this is a very beautiful picture, but it is also a very unusual picture because people don't usually associate Watteau with scenes of military life. And this painting is entitled The Portal at Valenciennes. It was painted around 1710, 1711 by Watteau, around the time, around 1709, 1710, when he was back in Valenciennes and then before returning to Paris. This is a time of the War of Spanish Succession. And this was another very important military event. Between 1701 and 1714, France was at war with pretty much every other European country. It was not quite a world war, but definitely a European war, one of the longest and most difficult wars fought by France in the 18th century. Louis XIV was attempting to put a French king on the throne of Spain. With the death of the last Habsburg king of Spain, with Charles II, the throne remained vacant in Spain and there were no descendants. And because of the links between France and Spain, of course, Louis XIV was married himself to one of the daughters of Philip IV of Spain. His mother, Anne of Austria, was the sister of Philip IV of Spain, in the same way that the King of Spain was married to a French princess. So there were several marriages between the two families, and Louis XIV was effectively married to his own cousin, Maria Theresa of Austria. Because of these links, the King of France believed that the rightful heir to the throne of Spain was his grandson, Philippe, Duke of Anjou. And the war was fought with England, with the Netherlands and a number of other countries, and eventually won by France. And so Philippe of Anjou did become the first Bourbon king of Spain, taking the name of Philip V of Spain, Felipe V. And so a branch of the royal family of France became the royal family of Spain, which is the same family to this day, to the present King of Spain, Philip VI. So this is a scene from the War of Spanish Succession. And Watteau was in Valenciennes in 1709, soon after one of the bloodiest battles of the war was fought, the Battle of Malplaquet, which was fought on September 11, 1709. Many friends of Watteau fought in this battle on the French side. One of his patrons lost a leg in the battle. So it was an event he knew very well. And around that time, Watteau started painting these military scenes, like the one at the Frick. There are only 3 surviving paintings of these military scenes by Watteau that we know of, but we know he produced more because others were engraved. And he produced a series of drawings of figures that he then reused for the paintings. But looking at the picture, we realize that this is not actually a military scene. It involves military figures, but they're guarding a city door. Here they are in their uniform, standing guard. But this is a very poetic image of military life. These beautiful young men are sort of lounging and talking to each other and resting by the door. And I love these figures. The one on the right seated with his rifle, and here they all are during a moment of rest. One of them is taking a nap, and they have these lovely dogs with them. You'd be amazed to know that actually soldiers at that time in the 18th century would go to battle bringing with them their wives and their dogs and many things that we wouldn't associate normally with war. Over the arch in this painting is, of course, the coat of arms of France, the lilies of the Bourbon family, pointing out that Valenciennes is a French city. And here is the door in the background that gives name to the painting, the portal at Valenciennes. Watteau made miraculously beautiful sketches of soldiers during this period in Valenciennes, probably around Valenciennes. And here they are, some of them resting, some of them standing. This, to me, is one of the most beautiful of these drawings at the Fondation Lucht in Paris. But the other paintings he made, as I said, 2 survive. One is the Line of March, which unfortunately is not in great condition, but it's now at York Art Gallery in England. And the other one is the Halt, which is at the Thyssen Museum in Madrid. And this again shows soldiers, you can see here with women, with some of their wives halting during a march during the War of Spanish Succession. These paintings were all brought together at the Frick in 2016. Edgar Munhall, who acquired the Portal of Valenciennes, wrote a beautiful little booklet on it when it was acquired. The book was published in 1992, but one of our previous curatorial fellows, Aaron Weil, who is now an assistant curator at the National Gallery in Washington, in DC. While he was a fellow between 2014 and 16, he worked on this topic and curated this very beautiful exhibition, which was called Watteau's Soldiers, where he reunited the 3 paintings from York, from Madrid, and the one from the Frick, and he brought together a number of very beautiful drawings and prints, works on paper by Watteau, showing preparatory sketches for some of these paintings. In the very back of this shot on the wall, you see the Portal of Valenciennes by Watteau, of course, at the Frick, surrounded by drawings associated with it, but also albums of prints that show engravings after paintings by Watteau made in this period, which unfortunately don't survive any longer. As Aaron was preparing for this exhibition, we traveled together to Valenciennes, and we decided that we would spend a day trying to find the portal at Valenciennes, the portal that is shown in the painting. So we met in Valenciennes in the summer of 2014, and we walked along the ramparts of the city trying to find this location. But what was surprising to us, well, it shouldn't have been, we should have known, but what was interesting was that the ramparts had been destroyed in the 19th century. Effectively, all of the city walls of Valenciennes were knocked down to create a ring road, a circle road that still surrounds Valenciennes. So we effectively spent a day walking along a highway. But we did to try and see if there were any remnants of any doors or any portals. And the only one we found, which was the same that had been discussed and published by Edgar Munhall in his 1992 book, was the only part of the ramparts that still stands. And it's the so-called Tour de la Dodène, which is a medieval structure then sort of added on in the 15th century. And it gives a sense of how powerful the walls of Valenciennes must have been. So this was a travel that we took searching for something that effectively doesn't exist anymore. It is impossible for us today to prove that the Portal of Valenciennes by Watteau is actually a real place rather than an imaginary one. And looking at the painting again, and having studied the drawings and looked at Watteau's way of working, it is actually very likely that the title, The Portal of Valenciennes, is a very imaginary one. It's a fantastic title. This was probably never meant to show a specific place, let alone not a specific place in Valenciennes. These are elements that are based on engravings that Watteau had access to and some of his drawings of soldiers. So he effectively put together figures and buildings that didn't belong together in this beautifully elegant little picture. So it is a work of fiction in many ways. Valenciennes, therefore, is in the background of this picture because the artist was born there and because the artist spent time there around the time this picture was painted. But the title, in a way, does not represent what this painting actually shows. So our trip to Valenciennes is in many ways a fantasy trip. We were there. Both Aaron and I enjoyed our trip looking for something that doesn't exist anymore. We found some remnants, but not what we were hoping for. But the show was a very wonderful and interesting show. And so I encourage you all, if you want to know more about this painting and about Watteau's portrayals of soldiers, to go on our website, frick.org, and there is a whole section on the exhibition. You can see some lectures and look at a lot of material on Watteau and to some degree on Valenciennes. Look forward to seeing you all for the next Travels with a Curator.